Our first reading is actually a classic story from the Zen Buddhist tradition. The Buddhist teacher Nanyan had a visitor who came to inquire about Zen. But instead of listening, the visitor kept talking about her own ideas. After a while, Nanyan served tea. He poured tea into his visitor's cup until it was full, and then he kept on pouring. Finally, the visitor could not restrain herself, and she said, "Can't you see that it's full? You can't get any more in." "Just so," said Nanyan, stopping at last. "And like this cup, you are filled with your own ideas. How can you expect me to give you Zen unless you offer me an empty cup?" Now from the book of Proverbs.
As the biblical reading this morning is from Proverbs chapter 10, verse 17. Those who heed their lessons are on life's path. Those who reject reprimand lead others astray.
Expectations are, well, are they mostly a good thing? Or mostly a bad thing? On the plus side, we know that children often do better. They often work harder, practice longer, and study more when their parents or teachers have high expectations. Psychologist Robert Rosenthal did some research in the 1960s. He tested children at school at the beginning of the school year with a test that he told teachers would assess or measure academic blooming. And that is, it would reveal which students were expected to begin a year of academic achievement. The teachers at the school, all 18 of them, were told which students in each class would fit this category. And all the students were tested at the end of the year to see how much they bloomed or improved. And of course, what the teachers didn't know, right, those who are teachers do know, was that the kids that they were told would bloom were assigned to the category at random. There was actually no reason to think that these particular kids would do any better than the others. But the teachers thought they would, and a lot of those kids did. Now, it tended to happen more with the younger children, those in first and second grade. But still, it was pretty interesting. The teachers, and probably other adults, can affect a child's behavior and success by their expectations of that child. As it turns out, this works with rats, too. Before Rosenthal did his research on teachers and their students, he did an experiment on psychology students and lab rats. He told his students that there were two groups of rats. One group had been bred to be good at running through mazes and finding cheese, and those rats were called Maze Bright. And the second group was not supposed to be good at this, and they were called Maze Dull. Maze Bright and Maze Dull. And actually, all the rats were just standard lab rats. But the rats that students thought were Maze Bright did learn the mazes more quickly than did the Maze Dull rats. Apparently, students had unconsciously influenced the rats by their expectations. This is called now the experimenter expectancy effect. And Rosenthal figured there might be a similar effect with teachers, which is why he did that with that other study. So if you're dealing with rats or first and second graders, expectation has a real effect. And here's a case where someone's expectations of himself have a powerful effect. This is a true story, by the way. It's one of those things that people think is an urban legend, but it actually is not. It actually happened. A mathematician at Stanford, George B. Danzig, who died in 2005, so about 20 years ago, told this story about what happened to him in 1940 when he was a student at Berkeley. He says, during my first year at Berkeley, I arrived late one day at one of Professor Jersey Neiman's classes. On the blackboard, there were 2 problems that I assumed had been assigned for homework. I copied them down. A few days later, I apologized to Neiman for taking so long to do the homework. The problem seemed to be a little harder to do than usual. I asked him if he still wanted it, and he told me to throw it on his desk. I did so reluctantly because his desk was covered with such a heap of papers that I feared my homework would be lost there forever. About 6 weeks later, one Sunday morning, about 8 o'clock, my wife and I were awakened by someone banging on the front door. It was Professor Neiman. He rushed in with papers in hand, all excited. I've just written an introduction to one of your papers. Read it so I can send it out right away for publication. For a minute, I had no idea what he was talking about. To make a long story short, the problems on the blackboard that I had solved thinking they were homework were in fact 2 famous unsolved problems in statistics. That was the first inkling I had that there was anything special about it. Now, can you imagine what would have happened if Danzig hadn't known that the problems on the board had never been solved? Would he have tried it? No, I don't think so. He would have known he couldn't do it. But because he didn't know, because he thought they were just homework, he expected to be able to solve them. And solve them he did. It might be interesting to speculate on what you and I could do if we didn't think it was out of our league. Now that's an argument for expectations being a good thing, but expecting children and students to fail can also have a powerful negative effect. And even well-intentioned expectations can sometimes have negative results. For example, how many people were raised with expectations that they can never fulfill, and they end up feeling like failures? Girls expected to be quiet and unassuming. Boys expected to be tough and unemotional. Viktor Frankl, in his book, Man's Search for Meaning, my only copy is a little small here, but if you want to check it out later, he wrote about his life in a Nazi concentration camp, and he had this story about a fellow camp president. Now, everyone knew there that Frankl was a doctor and a psychiatrist, and this particular camp resident came up to him and said, I would like to tell you something, doctor. I've had a strange dream. A voice told me that I should say only what I wanted to know, and all my questions would be answered. And I asked to know when the war would be over. What did your dream voice answer, I asked. And furtively he whispered to me, March 30th. Now when this man told me, this is again Frankl speaking, when he told me about his dream, he was convinced that the voice of his dream would be right. But as the promised day drew near, the wars which reached our camp made it appear very unlikely that we would be free on the promised date. On March 29th, he suddenly became ill and ran on high temperature. On March 30th, he lost consciousness. On March 31st, he was dead. To all outward appearances, he had died of typhus, Frankl says. But he thinks a contributing factor was a dashing of his expectations. Ironically, the camp was liberated not long afterwards, and if this man hadn't had this particular expectation, he might still have ended up succeeding. Now, there's been some interesting research done on the effects of alcohol. Now, we all know that if you drink a large amount of liquor, it has a very obvious effect on you. What if you just have one glass? Let's say 1 part vodka, 4 parts tonic water. In several studies, researchers took a bunch of people and divided them into 4 groups. I'm very low tech, so I bring my glass. Okay. group was given vodka and tonic water and was told what it was. This is the true sign. The second group got vodka and tonic, but was told that it was only tonic. The third group was just plain tonic, and they were told what it was. And the fourth group was given tonic, but they were told it was vodka and tonic. And everybody got one glass. And the people who believed they drank vodka got a little high, regardless of whether they had any vodka or not. And the people who believed they didn't have vodka did not get high, regardless of whether they drank it or not. I mean, the people here who only had the tonic, but thought it was, they got higher than the people who actually had it. So expectations can be powerful, positively or negatively. But whether they're positive or negative, they do tend to filter reality through our customary ways of viewing the world. Try a little experiment with me. Look at the words to the hymn of Make Me a Channel of the Peace. Did any of you notice this as we were singing? Any odd thing about this, the words? All right, we've got, if you look under the first verse where it says, make me a channel of your peace, where there is hatred, let me bring your love, where this is entry in your pardon, Lord, and where there's doubt. And the next one, again, on the two last lines, where there is darkness, only light, and where there's sadness and joy. And on the below, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love alone as well. And finally, make me a channel of your peace. It is important that we're important. Any of you catch at least one or two of those? Okay. Probably most of you, even if you didn't see them, didn't catch all of them. And that's because we tend to see what we expect to see. And that's actually a good thing most of the time, because it would take a long time to read anything if we had to go through it slowly enough to catch every possible irregularity. That's why you should never proofread your own material. So we, in general, go through life seeing more or less what we expect to see, and we save time that way. But that also means we tend to get our biases confirmed. Psychologists call this tendency expectation confirmation. We tend to ignore things that don't fit with our already held beliefs, and we look for things that confirm them. Now, at some point, of course, even long-held expectations can be shattered if we have enough evidence. And we probably all had that in our lives. And that happened, But think of all the times we didn't see the truth because we weren't ready to. Think of the people in our own country today who weren't yet ready to see the truth. Now, expectation confirmation does simplify our lives. And if we never know what to expect, it would take us all a long, long time to figure anything out. But it can also distort the way we see people in groups, especially the ones that are not part of our tribe. A personal example I remember from my college years, some of you may know that I once studied to be a Catholic priest. Actually, I went from kindergarten to master's degree in Catholic schools, and the last one being Catholic seminaries. And this was in the late 1960s and early 1970s. And it was a fairly, the theology was fairly liberal at this seminary. So they allowed, and in other ways too, they allowed us to have long hair and beard. So of course I grew a beard and let my hair go long. My mom and dad didn't like it so much. But they differed on which was worse. My mom hated the mustache and my dad hated the hair. Anyway, I looked pretty much like Jesus Christ would look if he had worn bell bottoms and paisley shirts. So I basically looked like a hippie. In fact, actually, when I slept too late in the morning, my parents would go, "Sleeping Jesus, get up." Anyway, expectations played a big role in how I was viewed by other people. If someone met me who didn't know I was studying to be a priest, they tended to have a good impression of me once they found out. To them, I looked like a hippie who was more respectful and spiritually responsible than they expected. They thought, how cool, this weird guy is actually into the church. But if they were told that they were going to meet a seminarian and already had their own expectations of what a priest-to-be would look like, then when they met me, they said, "Oh, how far church standards must be falling. They're letting their seminarians dress like this." So it was better to be a hippie who was studying to be a priest than a seminarian who dressed like a hippie. It was all about expectations. Now, the problem I have with expectations is that they sometimes, well, actually quite often, cause me grief in the end, especially when I expect people to act a certain way and they don't. I became very aware of this once when I heard someone talking about what she expected of other people. I think it was how she expected others to treat her, or how she expected to be behaved. And suddenly someone in the group said, "Well, you know what expectations are. They're resentments in training." Expectations, resentments in training. Now, I don't think the person who had been speaking heard this guy, because he just went on about how people were so disappointing. But the comment stuck with me, because I could see that it was frequently true in my own life, that my expectations are sometimes resentments in training. It's not necessarily that they start out with ill feeling or indignation behind them, but they so often end up there. They so often set me up for that in the end. A good example for me was when I was in college on a trip with a bunch of fellow seminarians in the Chicago area. Most of us were going to the West Coast for the summer, maybe it was for Christmas, I forget. Anyway, so we would rent a car and actually, get one of those cars that they let you drive across the country to a new place, and so it was not too expensive. On the way, we stopped to see, I think it was the Carlsbad Caverns. All I remember was that it was a beautiful and gigantic underground. It was an underground cathedral, is what it looked like, if you've ever been to the Carlsbad Caverns. Just beautiful. And I'll never forget how awe-inspiring that was. And many years later, I went to see the Cave of the Mountains here in Wisconsin, near Madison. And someone had told me how cool it was, and in my head I was thinking, I'll bet that's the place I visited years ago. That'll be so cool. Well, it was sort of cool. Not as vast and beautiful as I remembered, but it was okay. And then our tour guide said, "Okay, before we go into this next chamber, I want all the kids to come forward and close your eyes, because I think you will be surprised and amazed at what you see." And then my heart skipped a beat, and I thought, this must be where the real caves begin. I can hardly go. So I waited for the kids to go in first and ooh and on. Then I went in to see. Well, not what I was expecting. What I saw was a cave niche, like so many others we'd already seen, only this one had troll dolls in it. That was the big surprise. I don't think I've ever been so disappointed, except maybe in the last presidential election. But the thing is, if I hadn't been expecting something so grand, it probably would have been a good experience. The Cave of the Mountains is cool, but I brought expectations to it that didn't allow me to see that. But I've had the opposite experience too. When Craig and I first went to Italy, we decided to go to Venice. And when we got off at the Venice train, we expected to take a bus to get to Venice proper. But instead, when we walked out of the train station, we found ourselves standing right on the stairs leading to the water. We were already there. And because we didn't expect to see Venice so soon, we were overwhelmed by its beauty. I suppose that if we were ever to go back, we won't have that same feeling that we had that day. To this day, I still believe our lack of expectations is part of what made the trip so wonderful. In my family experience growing up, I can tell you that my parents expected all of us to grow up to be good Catholics. We were a very devout family, but chinks in the armor began to appear. First, it was my brother who got divorced. That was a Catholic no-no at that time. Then it was my other brother marrying outside the Catholic Church. And then it was me leaving the Catholic seminary and the Catholic Church, and even joining a different church. And worst of all, it being a Unitarian Universalist church, which was the worst of all possible religions. Eventually, someone told my mother to just lower her expectations. And she said, "At least your kids haven't killed anybody yet." And you know, my mom got a lot happier when she gave up her expectations of a good Catholic family to carry on. Ironically, no one in the family, other than my parents, stayed Catholic. One became a fundamentalist, and other became various other things. And actually, Mom's lowered expectations helped me in the end too, because I remember asking her once, "Mom, how did you feel when you found out I was gay? Did that bother you?" And she said, "Well, no. You'd already left Holy Mother of the Church. What difference did this make?" And another, this was a kind of a trivial one, but not long ago in Milwaukee, Clay and I went to eat at an interesting restaurant where we ordered the meal of the day. And included in it was a vegetable soup and a coffee cup. And Craig had some of it, but did not like it very much. So he gave his cup to me, and I finished it. I was surprised he didn't like it, because he normally likes vegetable soup. Later that day, we were talking about the meal, and I mentioned the soup, and he said, "Soup? I didn't know we had any soup." And that's when he realized that when the cup had come, he was expecting coffee or tea. Or some other hot beverage, and when he tasted it, it seemed awfully bad. But if he'd known it was soup, he probably would have loved it. The expectation of having a beverage wrecked the soup. Now, here are a few quotations about that you might find interesting. The physicist Stephen Hawking, who died not that long ago, said, "My expectations were reduced to 0 when I was 21. Ever since then, everything has been a bonus." And from the author Donald Miller, "When you stop expecting people to be perfect, you can like them for who they are." And my favorite, "There are 2 ways to be happy: improve your reality or lower your expectations." You know, the Buddha once taught that the cause of most suffering is that we want too much. We're too, well, the Sanskrit word he used is tanha, which literally means thirst. It's sometimes translated as desire or greed or addiction, and sometimes as clinging, possessiveness, or attachment. But its literal meaning is thirst. We thirst for a life that's better than what we have. We thirst for friends who always appreciate us, and for spouses who never disagree. Oh, we don't say those things overtly, but in our heart of hearts, that's what we find ourselves wanting and expecting. It's kind of greed. It's a kind of greed, actually. But because it's not necessarily for material things, we don't always recognize how greedy we are. And expectations are often a part of this thirst or greed. We expect our boss or supervisor to thank us for the good job we did, or at least notice it, and she doesn't. We're indignant, or at least disappointed. And we expect our parents to realize what great offspring we've been. And if they don't tell us that from time to time, or if they do tell us but not very convincingly, we feel let down. Or, I expect my sermon to be a big hit wherever I go. And if it's not, or at least I don't hear enough people convince me it was, I might feel a little disheartened. Not today, though. Don't worry. On the other hand, expectations like the one that mathematician had, that George Danzig, who expected to be able to do what he thought was a homework assignment, but was actually 2 unsolved problems in statistics, he reminds us that there may be talents and abilities in us that we haven't discovered because no one ever showed us the possibility, so we never expected to find anything. Now, I'm not trying to be Pollyanna here. I'm not saying you can achieve anything your heart desires or be anything you want to be. Only that the last word has not been spoken about you yet. And there's no telling what new ideas or talents you'll discover, or friends you will come to cherish. So, there you have it. Expectations can be powerful. They can be good or bad. They are both convenient and distorting. They are necessary and problematic. I can't tell you not to have any because that's not really possible. And I can't tell you to keep them high or low because there are good reasons for both at different times. But what I can suggest is, one, occasionally stop and notice when you have expectations and see what they are bringing to your experience. 2, don't be too attached to your expectations. Expect what you want from yourself or other people, but don't get bent out of shape when you or they don't fulfill them. Expectations, in a way, are like fine pottery. Hold them too tight and they'll shatter. And 3, sometimes intentionally engage in an activity without expectations. For example, a common Buddhist form of meditation is to do something in the present moment without filtering it through labels and concepts and categories. Like, eat something while being completely aware of the experience. Or wash dishes without thought of it as a job or a burden, but just feeling the suds in the water as your hand and sponge wash over the plate or the bowl or the fork. You might want to try this after the service today. If there are any snacks or just when you go home, eat your snack or drink your coffee or tea without preconceptions. Just be here now with whatever you're doing. Any of you who are old enough to remember Jay Leno, he sometimes had someone out among the people, and I'll never forget this. He had someone, they had different places where people selling things, and they set up this little kiosk. And they're, getting people who were coming by, taste this carrot. So they'd eat a carrot, and they'd say, now, taste the same kind of carrot, but I'm going to put it in this machine that will jiggle it up and down, and that will move the atoms and molecules in it up and down, so it'll change the taste. And so they did. They'd ask them, and they'd say, how's it? The first one, yeah, good. Now try this one. And they go, oh my God, it's so much better. and the guy doing this would say, would you buy a product like this if it was, oh, I certainly would. This improves everything. Well, it doesn't jiggle the atoms in there. It doesn't make any difference. But the second time you're doing it, either with expectations or without, you're just experiencing it as it is. Now, you don't have to do this all the time. Be aware of whatever's happening. It's not possible, but just once in a while, as a way to remind yourself that what you experience throughout your life is not always what is there, but what you brought to it. No need to cling to categories and judgments that may have worked in the past. Don't be a Klingon. Be willing to be surprised. That's the key to almost any new knowledge. Remember that there will always be pain in our lives, but suffering is sometimes optional. And remember, too, that the greatest obstacle to happiness may be the expectation in your mind of what it's supposed to look like. Good luck. And now as we pass the collection plate,